Katyusha barrage could lay waste a vast area of the battlefield, destroying everything in its path. Since the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army had changed out of all recognition. Stalin had moved to curb the power of the detested political commissars, and a new generation of competent and dedicated officers and NCOs had risen on their merits to displace party loyalists. As for the private soldier, even the German enemy had been forced to recognize that the men of the Red Army were not only courageous in battle, but also well-trained and extremely tough. For the Red Army soldier, discipline was harsh and unrelenting. Stalin had said that it took a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army, and tens of thousands had been shot for desertion at Stalingrad alone. During the course of the war, 238 generals and admirals would be shot or would die in penal battalions for failing to deliver the expected results. For commanders living with such a threat, the lives of ordinary soldiers were of little account, and there was an indifference to casualties that shocked even the Wehrmacht. The Red Army's offensive tactics reflected the value it placed on the lives of infantrymen. Major attacks were often launched not with elite guards armies, but by shock armies of infantry who would be thrown at the defences in vast numbers to create gaps which the elite units would then exploit. Often, the shock armies were themselves spearheaded by penal battalions, units made up of men who had committed military or civil crimes. Their missions were usually suicidal and could involve clearing minefields by marching across them in formation at gunpoint. By the end of 1944, the German army was a shadow of the awesome machine that 5 years earlier had unleashed blitzkrieg on an unsuspecting world. In the east, it could still field more than 3 million men, but appalling losses had severely reduced the quality of its fighting formations. At Hitler's insistence, under-strength divisions that should have been merged were retained as independent entities, carrying a heavy burden of administration and logistical support. German industry, in spite of increasing its output of war material to the highest level ever, was failing to keep up with the enemy's production, or with German losses, particularly in tanks and aircraft. By late 1944, the Mark V Panther made up around half the strength of German armoured divisions on the Eastern Front. The best medium tank deployed by any army in World War II, the Panther G incorporated many modifications suggested by tank crews in the field. In particular, the Panther's side armour had been increased in thickness, and the reliability of the tank's drivetrain had been greatly improved. Like earlier models, the Panther G was armed with a supremely well-designed, long-barreled 75mm gun, capable of penetrating 120mm of sloped armour at over 1,000 yards. The Panther could carry a massive ammunition load of 81 rounds. In January 1943, a new Tiger was ordered which would have a turret large enough to mount a longer, more powerful 88mm gun than its predecessor. The King Tiger's hull design was similar to the Panther, well sloped for greater protection, while frontal armor was increased to an unprecedented 150mm. The King Tiger weighed 70 tons and was the heaviest tank to serve in World War II. Delivered to frontline units in June 1944, the new tanks quickly showed they could easily destroy any opponent. In all, 489 King Tigers were built. The Panzerfaust was a single-shot, throwaway anti-tank weapon. First produced in the summer of 1943, the device was a 120mm hollow-charge stick bomb fitted into a tube which contained the propellant. The Panzerfaust had a crude sight and trigger arrangement, but at distances of up to 150 meters, it could penetrate the side or rear armor of any existing tank and most frontal armor under the right conditions. Because of its cheapness, ease of use and light weight, anyone could be trained to use the Panzerfaust. In the Battle of Berlin, Home Guard and Hitler Youth would use the weapon to take a heavy toll of Soviet tanks. Germany's second infantry anti-tank rocket was the Panzer Schreck, introduced in August 1944. A copy of the American bazooka, the weapon fired an 88mm shaped charge projectile. The launching tube was reusable, and because of its shape, the weapon was known to German troops as the stovepipe. By the last months of the war, large numbers of Panzer Schrecks and Panzerfausts had been issued to tank destroyer battalions and Panzer Grenadiers. For the first time, the infantryman had become an extremely dangerous opponent for tanks, particularly in wooded or built-up areas where cover was good. Because both weapons produced quantities of flame and smoke, the position of the user was betrayed at once, and it was vital to change location immediately after firing. The MG-42, one of the most successful machine guns ever built, had been designed in 1937. The new technology of metal stamping was then still in its infancy and had never been used to make anything quite so intricate. The idea of stamping, pressing and welding horrified traditional gun makers, accustomed to producing weapons to the highest quality. But the finished machine gun successfully passed its last field trials in the autumn of 1941. Although crudely manufactured, the MG-42 was extremely sturdy, had a very simple barrel-changing system and an exceptionally high rate of fire. In 1942, it was approved for mass production, each unit costing a quarter less than its predecessor, the MG-34. When an example was first captured by the Allies, its performance amazed ordnance experts. The MG-42 was a popular weapon with the troops of the Wehrmacht, but it did have some weaknesses. Its high rate of fire made it wasteful of ammunition, and it had a tendency to become unstable after prolonged bursts on automatic. In the last half of 1944, the German armed forces in the East had lost 800,000 men. In the West,